In 2020, a team of over 100 researchers from universities across Europe and North America published the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted on the Viking Age. They analyzed genetic material from 442 individuals whose remains had been found at Viking Age burial sites across Scandinavia, Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Russia, and the Baltic states. The study, published in the journal Nature, upended nearly everything the popular imagination has assumed about who the Vikings were. The first thing the DNA dismantled was the idea that Viking was an ethnicity. It is not. It never was. The word Viking in Old Norse described an activity, going raiding or trading by sea. A person could go Viking the way a person might go fishing. It was a seasonal occupation, a way of earning status and wealth, not a biological category or a national identity. The 2020 study confirmed this linguistically understood point in genomic terms. The people buried in Viking Age graves across Northern Europe came from dramatically varied genetic backgrounds. Individuals buried in full Viking warrior context in Scandinavia, with weapons, ship equipment, and the material culture that defines the Viking Age archaeologically, carried DNA that traced to Southern Europe, to Eastern Europe, to the steppes of Central Asia, and in some cases to populations from as far as the edges of the ancient Silk Road. Viking was what these people did. It was not what they were born. The second revelation was about hair color. The popular image of the blonde Viking, reinforced by centuries of romantic nationalism and more recently by television dramas, is, according to the ancient DNA, not representative of the actual Viking Age population. The genetic variants associated with dark brown and black hair were actually more common in the ancient DNA samples from Scandinavia than the variants associated with the light hair that the stereotype requires. Blonde hair was present, and it was more common in Scandinavia than in many other parts of Europe, but it was not universal, and it was not even the majority phenotype in all regions. The real Viking Age population was more genetically varied and probably more visually varied than the cultural image of the blue-eyed blonde warrior. This is the story of what the bones actually tell us. The 2020 Nature study was led by Eske Willerslev of the University of Copenhagen and the University of Cambridge, with co-authors from over 50 institutions worldwide. It represented not just a scientific achievement, but a logistical one, coordinating sample collection, DNA extraction, and genomic analysis across hundreds of sites in more than a dozen countries over several years. The genetic foundation of the Scandinavian population itself, the substrate from which the Viking Age population emerged, was already a mixture of three distinct ancestral streams by the time the Viking Age began in the late 8th century AD. The oldest component was the ancient Scandinavian hunter-gatherer ancestry, the descendants of the people who had lived in northern Europe since the retreat of the glaciers at the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. This ancestry was present at elevated levels in Scandinavia relative to much of the rest of Europe, because Scandinavia's geographic position at the northern edge of the habitable zone limited the degree to which subsequent migrations diluted the ancient hunter-gatherer genetic signal. The second component was the Neolithic farmer ancestry, the descendants of agricultural communities that had spread from Anatolia into Europe, beginning around 9,000 years ago. In Scandinavia, this ancestry arrived somewhat later than in the rest of Europe, and the mixing between the incoming farmers and the existing hunter-gatherers was more gradual and more even than in southern and central Europe. The third component was the Bronze Age steppe ancestry, the genetic signal of the Yamnaya and related pastoralist cultures that had expanded from the Eurasian grasslands around 5,000 years ago. In Scandinavia, this component arrived with the corded ware culture and formed a significant portion of the Bronze Age and Iron Age genetic profile. By the beginning of the Viking Age, these three streams had been combined for thousands of years. But the 2020 Nature study revealed something unexpected about the Viking Age itself. Significant additional genetic mixing occurred during this period, as the movement of people, raiders, traders, settlers, enslaved individuals, brought new ancestry into both Scandinavia and the regions the Vikings reached. The Viking Age was not just a period of Scandinavian expansion outward. It was also a period of genetic inflow, as people from Britain, Ireland, the Frankish world, and the Slavic East were brought or came voluntarily into Scandinavian communities. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia, the indigenous reindeer-herding culture of the far north, contributed a distinct genetic signal to the ancient DNA record of the Viking Age. The Sami carry unusual proportions of ancient Siberian hunter-gatherer ancestry that distinguishes them from the southern Scandinavian populations. The interaction between Norse farming societies and Sami hunter-gatherer societies, including tribute relationships, trade, and occasional intermarriage, is documented both archaeologically and now in the ancient DNA of borderland populations. The social structure of Viking Age Scandinavia was organized around a clear three-tier hierarchy, and the ancient DNA evidence has provided direct biological confirmation of how this hierarchy functioned and what its genetic consequences were. At the bottom of the social order were the thralls, enslaved people. Slavery was fundamental to the Viking Age economy. Raiding for enslaved people was as economically significant as raiding for silver, and the Viking trade routes that connected Scandinavia to the Islamic Caliphate, running through the rivers of Russia to Constantinople and Baghdad, were substantially organized around the export of enslaved people from northern and eastern Europe in exchange for silver dirhams, silk, and luxury goods. The Arabic traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, whose account of his 922 AD embassy to the Volga Bulgars includes the most detailed first-hand description of Viking society ever written, documented enslaved people as a prominent feature of the Viking trading settlements he visited. The ancient DNA evidence for the impact of slavery on Scandinavian genetic history is found in an unexpected pattern in the 2020 study. Elevated levels of ancestry from the British Isles, specifically from Scotland, Ireland, and northern England, in populations from Iceland and from parts of Norway and Denmark. This British Isles genetic signal did not arrive through free migration. It arrived primarily through the enslaved people who were taken from the coasts of Britain and Ireland during Viking raids and transported to Scandinavia and the Norse colonies. The genetic trace of Viking Age slavery is still measurable in the modern population of Iceland, where it has been shown that a significant fraction of the female founding population of the island had ancestry from the British Isles, consistent with enslaved women being brought there from across the Irish Sea. Iceland's founding population genetics are unusually well documented because Iceland was uninhabited before Norse settlement in the late 9th century. There was no pre-existing population with whom the settlers could mix. The founders brought their genetics with them, and the island's subsequent relative isolation preserved those founding genetic patterns. Studies of modern Icelandic DNA confirm the asymmetric origin story. The male founding contribution is predominantly Scandinavian, while the female contribution is substantially from the British Isles. The implication is uncomfortable but scientifically clear. Above the thralls were the carls, free farmers and craftspeople who formed the backbone of Viking Age society. And above them, the jarls, the aristocratic warrior class whose wealth, ships, and political connections defined the outer reaches of Viking Age power. In 1878, archaeologists excavating the Viking Age trading town of Birka on an island in Lake Mälaren, Sweden, opened what they described as one of the finest warrior graves ever found. The burial, designated BJ581, contained a complete set of weapons: a sword, an axe, a spear, shields, a bow with a quiver of arrows, a battle knife, along with 2 sacrificed horses and a set of gaming pieces that some scholars interpreted as indicating tactical military planning. The individual was assumed, without question, to be male. For 140 years, this assumption was incorporated into every scholarly discussion of Viking Age military culture. BJ.581 was cited as an exemplary warrior burial, used to illustrate the equipment and status of the Viking warrior elite. Photographs of the grave goods appeared in textbooks and museum exhibitions worldwide. In 2017, a team led by Anna Wessman and Charlotte Hedenstierna Jonsson of Stockholm University subjected the remains to ancient DNA analysis as part of a broader study of the Burka population. The result was unambiguous. The biological sex of the Burka warrior was female. The revelation generated immediate controversy. Some scholars questioned whether the DNA might have been contaminated or whether the bones in the grave might have been mixed with bones from another burial. The team addressed each objection systematically. The osteological analysis confirmed the biological sex. The DNA was replicated in an independent laboratory. The stratigraphic analysis confirmed that the burial had not been disturbed. The individual was female, and she had been buried as a warrior of the highest status. The Burka warrior is now one of the most discussed individuals in Viking Age archaeology. Her existence doesn't prove that female warriors were common. The evidence suggests they were a small minority. But it demonstrates that the role was possible, recognized, and honored with the highest burial treatment available. The ancient DNA didn't just identify an individual's biological sex, it permanently changed how scholars interpret Viking Age gender and warfare. The Burka warrior burial's discovery also prompted archaeologists to systematically re-examine other Viking Age burials, where sex had been assumed rather than verified. Follow-up studies across Scandinavia identified a small but statistically significant number of additional weapon burials containing individuals whose biological sex, when tested by DNA, did not match the assumed male identification. The phenomenon was not common. The vast majority of weapon burials do contain male individuals, but it was real, and the evidence suggests that the social category of warrior in Viking Age society was not absolutely restricted by biological sex. The ritual life of the Viking Age was organized around a cosmology of extraordinary richness and internal consistency. And the physical evidence of that cosmology, preserved in burial sites across the Norse world, has been considerably clarified by the ancient DNA analysis of the individuals interred in its most elaborate expressions. The ship burial was the ultimate statement of Viking Age religious belief. To place a dead person inside a ship, or to build a ship-shaped stone setting over a burial, was to equip them for the journey to the afterlife in the most practical terms the Viking worldview could conceive. The Norse afterlife was not a place you arrived at by dying. It was a place you sailed to, or rowed to, or were carried to. The ship was not a metaphor, it was transportation. The Oseberg ship burial, excavated in Norway in 1904 and 1905, remains the most elaborately preserved Viking Age burial ever found. Two women were interred in a large oak ship dating to around 834 AD, accompanied by a remarkable collection of objects. 4 carved sleighs, a decorated cart, 15 horses, 6 dogs, weaving equipment, kitchen tools, and personal ornaments. The richness of the burial indicates that at least one of the 2 women was of the highest social status, possibly a queen or a vulva, a female religious specialist who in Norse society occupied a position of considerable spiritual authority. Ancient DNA analysis of the Oseberg individuals confirmed that they were not closely related to each other. They were not mother and daughter or sisters. One carried ancestry most consistent with the local Scandinavian population. The other showed a genetic profile with components suggesting origins from the region of the Black Sea or further east, consistent with the extended trade connections of the Norwegian aristocracy at this period. Even in death, at the pinnacle of Norse aristocratic society, the genetic diversity of the Viking Age was present. The Thing, the assembly system through which free Viking Age men made collective decisions about law, disputes, and community matters, represents one of the earliest documented forms of parliamentary governance in European history. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930 AD, is the oldest surviving parliament in the world. The decision-making traditions developed in these Norse assemblies influenced the development of parliamentary systems in the countries where Norse settlement was most intense, including England and the Scottish Islands. The so-called blood eagle, described in the Icelandic sagas as a ritual method of sacrifice in which the ribs of a living person were cut open to expose the lungs, is one of the most debated practices in Viking Age scholarship. The Viking longship is, by any technical assessment, one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the early medieval world, and the DNA evidence for where its builders came from confirms that the technical tradition that produced it was the product of a specific, geographically concentrated population with a specific evolutionary relationship to the sea. The design of the longship represents the optimization of several competing engineering requirements simultaneously. It had to be seaworthy enough to cross the open North Atlantic, the route between Norway and Iceland, between Iceland and Greenland, and eventually between Greenland and North America, involves some of the most demanding ocean conditions on Earth. It had to be shallow enough in draft to row up rivers and beach on shores without harbors. It had to be flexible enough to survive wave action that would break a more rigid hull. And it had to be fast enough under both oar and sail to function as a raiding vessel, where speed was militarily critical. The solution? A long, narrow, clinker-built hull with a shallow keel, flexible through its overlapping strake construction, capable of being carried overland between river systems, was developed in Scandinavia over several centuries of incremental refinement before the Viking Age began. Ancient DNA from the populations that developed this technology shows the elevated levels of ancient hunter-gatherer ancestry that characterize Scandinavian populations. Ancestry from people whose entire existence had been organized around the coastal and riverine environments of northern Europe for thousands of years. In 1021 AD, according to dendrochronological analysis published in 2021, Norse settlers built structures at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, making this the earliest confirmed European presence in the Americas, 471 years before Columbus's 1492 voyage. The DNA evidence from L'Anse aux Meadows and from the Greenland Norse colonies documents the genetic profile of these westernmost Vikings, predominantly Scandinavian, with the admixture of British Isles ancestry that characterized the broader Norse Atlantic world. Their descendants, if any survived long enough to have them, did not persist. The Greenland Norse colony was abandoned by approximately 1400 AD. But for a brief period, Norse genes were present on the North American continent. The sunstone, the solarstein of the Norse sagas, has been identified by modern researchers as most likely a crystal of Iceland spar, a form of calcite that exhibits strong birefringence. When held up to the sky, even through heavy cloud cover, Iceland spar produces a pattern of light polarization that allows a skilled user to locate the position of the sun. The popular image of the Viking feasting on vast quantities of meat, roasted whole animals, overflowing drinking horns, the heroic carnivore lifestyle, is one of the more dramatically inaccurate Viking stereotypes. The actual dietary evidence, recoverable from both isotope analysis of skeletal remains and from archaeological food deposits, tells a story considerably more complex and considerably more vegetable-heavy. Stable isotope analysis of nitrogen and carbon ratios in Viking Age skeletal collagen provides a reliable dietary signature. High nitrogen ratios indicate high protein consumption. Marine protein specifically produces the highest nitrogen signals. Carbon ratios distinguish between terrestrial and marine food sources. The results from Viking Age Norwegian and Danish populations show a diet that included significant quantities of marine fish, particularly herring, cod, and other North Atlantic species, alongside cereals, particularly rye and barley, and various legumes and root vegetables. Meat from domesticated animals was present, but was not the dietary foundation that the cultural image suggests. The find of intestinal parasite eggs, primarily Trichuris trichiura, whipworm, and Ascaris lumbricoides, roundworm, in Viking Age latrines and in the abdominal contents of preserved remains is, as the outline notes, remarkably consistent across sites. Every excavated Viking Age settlement with sufficient preservation has produced evidence of these parasites. This is not a sign of unusual poor hygiene. It reflects the universal background level of intestinal parasite exposure in pre-modern agricultural societies where human and animal feces contaminated water and soil routinely. What is genuinely unusual about Viking Age hygiene relative to contemporary medieval European cultures is the physical evidence of grooming practice. Fine-toothed combs made from antler and bone, ideal for removing lice, are found in extraordinary quantities at Viking Age sites, suggesting regular use. Ear spoons, tweezers, and small scissors or nail cutters appear in personal grooming kits found in burials of both men and women. The Arabic traveller Ibn Fadlan, whose 10th century account is our most detailed contemporary description of Norse society, noted with apparent approval that the Norsemen he observed washed their faces and combed their hair each morning, a practice that struck him as noteworthy in a European context. The DNA of individuals from Viking Age Dublin, excavated at the Wood Quay site, shows the genetic mixing of Norse settlers in the existing Irish population that would eventually produce the distinctive genetic profile of modern Dubliners. The name Dublin itself, Dú Linn in Irish, meaning black pool, predates Norse settlement, but the city's commercial and urban character was substantially shaped by the Norse traders who established it as a major trading port in the 9th century. The military reputation of the Vikings rested on a combination of factors: tactical flexibility, psychological impact, the element of surprise in coastal raids, and, in set-piece battles, the disciplined use of the shield wall formation that contemporary sources describe with genuine respect. But one material advantage deserves specific attention because it represents a genuine technological anomaly that modern metallurgical analysis has confirmed. The Ulfbert sword. Beginning in approximately the 9th century AD, a category of sword blades began to appear in Scandinavia that were inscribed with a cross and the letters VLFBERHT. Analysis of surviving Ulfbert blades has revealed that they were made from crucible steel, a form of steel with carbon content and slag elimination far superior to the pattern-welded swords that were standard in contemporary European metalworking. Crucible steel of this quality was manufactured in the Islamic world, particularly in the region of modern Iran and Central Asia, using techniques that European smiths had not independently developed. The carbon content and crystalline structure of Ulfbert steel is closer to modern high-quality steel than to any other contemporary European metalwork. How did this technology reach Scandinavia? The Viking trade routes through the river systems of Russia, connecting the Baltic Sea to the Caspian Sea and the Islamic Caliphate, are the most plausible explanation. Silver dirhams minted in Baghdad, Samarkand, and Tashkent are found in extraordinary quantities at Viking Age hoarding sites across Scandinavia, documenting the scale of this trade. Ulfbert steel was likely either imported directly or produced using techniques learned through contact with Islamic metalworkers along these same routes. The horned helmet, which does not appear in any reliable Viking Age archaeological context, became associated with Vikings through a 19th century Swedish costume design for a Wagner opera. an artistic choice that proved remarkably durable. No horned helmet has ever been found in a Viking Age burial. The actual helmets were rounded iron caps with nose guards. The berserker tradition, the Norse warriors who reportedly fought in a trance-like state of uncontrollable fury, has been the subject of both historical and pharmacological analysis. The sagas describe berserkers as howling, biting their shields, and apparently impervious to pain during combat. The shield wall, the formation in which warriors locked overlapping shields in a tight line to present an impenetrable defensive front, was the standard tactical formation of Viking Age battle when numerical strength allowed it. Contemporary accounts from battles including Stamford Bridge in 1066 describe shield walls held and broken in terms that make clear how central the formation was to Viking Age warfare. The full geographic reach of the Viking dispersal was staggering in its extent, and the ancient DNA left by Viking-descended populations in places as far apart as Normandy in France, Kiev in Ukraine, and Constantinople in Turkey documents a transformation that was as much cultural as genetic. The Normans, from the Old Norse Northmen, meaning Northmen, were the descendants of Viking settlers who had been granted the territory of what is now Normandy by the Frankish king Charles the Simple in 911 AD. Within a few generations, these Norse settlers had adopted the French language, converted fully to Christianity, and developed the particular combination of military culture and administrative sophistication that would make the Norman dynasty one of the most consequential political forces in 11th century Europe. They conquered England in 1066 and southern Italy and Sicily in the same generation. Ancient DNA from Norman period burial sites in Normandy shows the expected pattern: a founding genetic contribution from Scandinavia, detectable but already significantly diluted by admixture with the Frankish population within 2 to 3 generations of the original settlement. By the time of the 1066 conquest, the Normans were genetically mostly Frankish, with a Scandinavian component. They were politically and culturally Norman, which is to say, a synthesis that was neither purely Norse nor purely French. The Rus, the Norse traders and warriors who established the trading settlements and political structures that became the principalities of early medieval Russia and Ukraine, followed a similar trajectory of genetic dilution. The name Russia itself is derived from the Old Norse Rus and the Varangian Rus, who founded the Principality of Novgorod in the 9th century, were Norse speakers. Within 2 to 3 generations, they had adopted the Slavic language of the majority population they ruled, while their descendants continued to trade and occasionally raid as far south as Constantinople, where they served as the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors. The Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, recruited exclusively from Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors, represents one of the most striking examples of Viking integration into the broader medieval world. Members of the Guard have left runic inscriptions in the marble balustrades of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. One inscription, partially legible, includes a Norse personal name. Norsemen stood guard in the greatest church in Christendom, thousands of kilometers from the fjords where their ancestors had been born, and they left their mark in the oldest alphabet in the north, on the marble of the most sophisticated building in the south. Let's bring everything together, because the 2020 Nature study on Viking Age ancient DNA was not just a contribution to medieval history, it was a statement about what genetic science can reveal when applied to one of the most mythologized peoples in the cultural imagination of the modern world. The study confirmed that approximately 1 in 33 people in the United Kingdom today carries detectable Viking Age ancestry. Ancestry traceable specifically to the Scandinavian migration period of the 9th through 11th centuries, distinct from the earlier Germanic migrations of the Anglo-Saxon period. In Scotland and Ireland, and in the areas of eastern England that constituted the historical Danelaw, the frequency is higher. In Orkney and Shetland, which were Norse territory until 1468, it is higher still. These proportions are not surprises to population geneticists. They are consistent with what the historical record of Viking settlement would predict. What the ancient DNA has added is the precision to distinguish Viking-derived ancestry from earlier Germanic ancestry, and the ability to trace specific lineages back to their Scandinavian source populations. The study also confirmed something about the nature of Viking expansion that the popular narrative of brutal raiding consistently obscures. The Vikings were, for most of the period, as much traders, settlers, and political organizers as they were raiders. The Silk Road connections that brought Islamic silver to Scandinavia were maintained by merchants operating across thousands of kilometers of river and steppe. The Norse settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland were agricultural and pastoral communities. The Norse principalities of Russia were administrative and commercial entities. The raiding was real, and it was sometimes ferocious, but it was one activity among many, and the genetic legacy it left is inseparable from the legacy of everything else these people did. Every person who takes a commercial DNA test today and finds Scandinavian ancestry, whether they are living in Reykjavik or Auckland, Dublin or Toronto, is detecting the downstream consequence of a period of extraordinary human mobility that began in the late 8th century and reshaped the genetic map of the North Atlantic world. The Vikings did not just raid, they settled, they traded, they married, they had children. And those children, and their children, and the 1,000 years of descendants that followed carry the evidence of all of it in their DNA. The genetic legacy of the Viking Age is not something confined to Scandinavia or to the specific countries where Norse settlement was most intense. The story is still being written. The genetic breadth of the Viking Age, documented now in 442 ancient genomes, is its defining biological characteristic.